All right, chapter 8. Next day, Mr. Golyakin awoke at 8 o'clock as usual. Once awake, he immediately recalled the events of the previous evening. He remembered them and he frowned, made a complete fool of himself. Made a complete fool of myself yesterday, he thought, sitting up slightly in bed and glancing at his guest's bed. But how great his astonishment on finding that not only his guest, but even the bed on which he had slept had gone from the room. What's going on? Mr. Golyakin almost shrieked. What's happened? What on earth's the meaning of this new state of affairs? While Mr. Golyakin was gaping in open-mouthed bewilderment at the empty space, the door creaked and in came Petrushka with the tea tray. Where is he? Where on earth is he? Our hero muttered barely audibly, pointing to the place allotted to his guest the night before. At first, Petrushka did not answer or even look at his master, but peered into the right-hand corner so that Mr. Golyakin felt obliged to look into the corner on the right. Then after a silence, Petrushka replied in his gruff and husky voice, "The master's not home." "You fool, I'm your master, Petrushka," exclaimed Mr. Golyakin in a faltering voice, staring wide-eyed at his servant. Petrushka made no reply, but gave Mr. Golyakin such a look that Mr. Golyakin blushed to the roots of his hair, a look of such insulting reproachfulness that was tantamount to nothing less than a sheer abuse. Mr. Golyakin lost heart, as they say. At length, Petrushka announced that the other one had left about an hour and a half ago, as he wouldn't wait. Of course, this reply was both probable and plausible. Petrushka was obviously not lying, and his insolent look and the words the other one were merely the consequence of the whole beastly episode. All the same, he understood, albeit only vaguely, that something was amiss and that fate held in store for him some other present, and not in the least agreeable at that. Good, we'll see, he thought, we'll see, we'll get to the bottom of all this, all in good time. Oh Lord, he moaned in conclusion, already in quite a different tone of voice. Why did I have to invite him? What point was there in doing that? I'm well and truly putting myself into their thieves' noose and tightening it around my own neck. Oh, what a head, what a head. Just can't help blurting things out like some urchin, like some clerk, some low-ranking riffraff, some spineless creature, some lousy dishcloth, you gossip, you old woman. Saints preserve us, and the verses he wrote, the rogue, declaring his love for me. How could I mean to say, how can I show that scoundrel the door as politely as possible should he return? It goes without saying that there's lots of different turns of phrase. There's many ways I could say, well, it's like this, what with my meager salary, or I could scare him by saying, taking this and that into account, I'm obliged to express myself this way. You must pay half for food and lodging and give me the money in advance. No, blast it, that won't do. It would sully my reputation. It's not in the least tactful. Perhaps I could somehow do it like this. I could get Petrushka to spite him, to neglect him, to be rude to him somehow, and so get rid of him, the way I could play one off against the other. No, damn it, no. It's dangerous. Okay, where is that? It's dangerous. And again, if you look at it from the viewpoint, it's really not good at all. Not good at all. So what if he doesn't come? Would that be a bad thing? I gave the game away to him yesterday. Oh, it's it's really a very bad business. Oh, what a head I've got. What a damn head I've got. I can't seem to knock what I need to into my noddle. Can't knock any sense into it. Well, what if he does come and he refuses? But God grant me he will come. I'd be so terribly glad if he did come. Such were Mr. Golyakin's reflections as he swallowed his tea, constantly glancing at the clock on the wall. 8:45. It's really time I was off, but something's going to happen. What will it be? I'd like to know what's so particularly special that's being concealed here. I mean, the aim and the objective, the various catches there. It would be good to know exactly what these people are aiming at and what their first step will be. Mr. Golyakin could bear it no longer, threw down his pipe, half-smoked, dressed, and set off for the office, eager to nip the danger in the bud and to reassure himself by actually being there personally. And there was danger, that he knew himself, that there was danger. So now we'll get to the bottom of this, said Mr. Golyakin, removing his overcoat and galoshes in the vestibule. Now we'll fathom it all out. Having decided on this course of action, our hero tidied his clothes, assumed a formal official air, and was about to pass through into the next room, and suddenly, right in the doorway, he collided with his friend and acquaintance of yesterday. Mr. Golyakin Jr. appeared not to notice Mr. Golyakin Sr., although their noses nearly met. Mr. Golyakin Jr. seemed terribly busy and was breathlessly dashing off somewhere. He had such an official, business-like air that anyone could see that he had been sent on a special mission. "Oh, it's you, Yakov Petrovich," said our hero, grabbing last night's guest by the arm. Later, please excuse me and tell me later," cried Mr. Golyakin Jr., pushing forward. "If you don't mind, but it seems you wanted Yakov Petrovich too." "What's that? Do hurry up and explain." Here, Mr. Golyakin's guest of yesterday halted as if he were being forced against his will, and he put one ear right up to Mr. Golyakin's nose. "I must say, I'm most surprised at this reception, Yakov Petrovich, a reception I never could have expected. For everything there is an official procedure. Report to His Excellency's secretary and then make proper application to the gentleman in charge of the office. Do you have a request? Well, I don't know, Yakov Petrovich. You do amaze me, Yakov Petrovich. Either you don't recognize me or you're having your little joke and keeping with your innate cheerfulness. Oh, it's you, said Mr. Golyakin Jr., as if he'd only now recognized Mr. Golyakin Sr. So it's you. Well, now, did you have a good night? Here, Mr. Golyakin Jr. gave a faint smile, a formal official smile, not at all the kind he should have given, because after all, he owed Mr. Golyakin a debt of gratitude. And after that formal official smile, he added that, for his part, he was absolutely delighted Mr. Golyakin had slept well. Then he bent forward slightly, shuffled his feet, looked right, then left, glanced down at the floor, headed for a side door, and rapidly whispered that he was on a special mission, darting into the next room and disappearing in a flash. Well, there's a nice thing, whispered our hero, momentarily stunned. There's a pretty kettle of fish, so that's how things are. At this point, Mr. Golyakin felt shivers running up and down his spine. However, he said to himself as he made his way to his department, I've been talking about such circumstances for ages. I had the feeling long ago that he was on a special mission. Yes, only yesterday I said that man was being sent on a special mission. Have you finished that document you were working on yesterday, Yakov Petrovich? Anton Antonovich Satochin asked Mr. Golyakin as he took his seat next to him. Do you have it here? It's here, whispered Golyakin, looking at his head clerk with a rather lost expression. Right, sir, I'm saying this as Andrei Filipovich has asked for it twice already. His Excellency will be wanting it before you know it. It's all right, it's finished, sir. Oh, that's good, sir. I, Anton Antonovich, think I have always performed my duties conscientiously, and I've always taken great care over the tasks entrusted me by my superiors. I've always dealt with them most zealously. Yes, but what are you driving at? Nothing, Anton Antonovich. Only want to explain that I wanted to declare that sometimes disloyalty and envy spare no one in their quest for the disgusting daily sustenance. Forgive me, but I don't quite follow. To whom are you referring? All I meant, Anton Antonovich, was that I keep to the straight and narrow, that I despise deviousness, that I'm not one for intrigues. If you'll permit me to express myself this way, and I can very justly be proud of this. Yes, that's so, and as far as I understand it, I admit the full justice of your argument. But allow me to point out, Yakov Petrovich, that in good society, personal remarks about other people are not altogether impermissible. For example, I'm prepared to tolerate them behind my back, since who isn't reviled behind his back? But say what you like, I shall not allow anyone to be insolent to my face, my dear sir. I, dear sir, have turned gray in government service, and I shall not allow anyone to be insolent to me in my twilight years. No, Anton Antonovich, don't you see, Anton Antonovich? It appears, Anton Antonovich, you haven't quite understood. I, if you don't mind, Anton Antonovich, can only consider it an honor on my part. Well, then I beg you to forgive me, too. I was trained in the old school. It's too late for me to learn these newfangled ways of yours. Up to now, I think my grasp of things has been good enough to serve my country. As you well know, sir, I have a medal for 20 years irreproachable service. Yes, I appreciate that, Anton Antonovich. For my part, I really do appreciate all that. But that wasn't what I meant. I was talking about a mask, Anton Antonovich. A mask, sir. Again, I'm afraid you'll misinterpret my meaning, that is, the meaning of what I've just been saying, as you yourself put it, Anton Antonovich. I'm only developing the theory, putting forward the idea, Anton Antonovich, that people who wear masks aren't at all rare now, and that nowadays it's hard to recognize the man beneath the mask. Well, it's not so hard. Sometimes it's even fairly easy. Sometimes you don't have to look very hard. No, I'm talking to myself, Anton Antonovich. I'm talking to myself, for example. When I say that I wear a mask, it's only when I need to. That is, only for carnivals or festive gatherings, speaking literally. But I don't wear one every day in front of people. Speaking in a different and more cryptic sense. That's what I wanted to say, Anton Antonovich. Very well, but let's leave all that for the moment. Besides, I just don't have the time right now, said Anton Antonovich. Said Anton Antonovich, rising from his seat, collecting some papers from a report for His Excellency. I fancy this little business of yours will be cleared up in a very short time. You yourself will see whom you should blame, whom you should accuse, but in the meantime, I humbly beg you to spare me any further private discussions and gossip that might be detrimental to work. But no, Anton Antonovich, Mr. Golyakin began, telling the retreating Anton Antonovich, paling slightly. I, Anton Antonovich, never thought that. What is this? What winds are blowing here, and what's the meaning of this new obstacle? Our hero, now left alone, kept thinking to himself. At that very moment when our forlorn and half-crushed hero was preparing to solve this new question, there came a noise, a surge of activity from the next room. The door opened, and there appeared in the doorway a breathless Andrei Filipovich, who only a few moments before had gone to His Excellency's room on some business. He called to Mr. Golyakin, realizing what it was all about and reluctant to keep Andrei Filipovich waiting. Mr. Golyakin leaped from his seat and, as was fitting, started frantically busying himself, putting the required portfolio in order, and prepared to follow both portfolio and Andrei Filipovich into His Excellency's study. Suddenly, virtually from under the arm of Andrei Filipovich, who was standing at the moment right in the doorway, in flew Mr. Golyakin Jr., bustling, breathless, and exhausted from his exertions, and with an important, determined air as he rolled right up to Mr. Golyakin Sr. This attack was the last thing he was expecting. "The papers, Yakov Petrovich, the papers. His Excellency is pleased to inquire if you have them already," twittered Mr. Golyakin Sr.'s friend under his breath. "Andrei Filipovich is waiting for you." "I know he's waiting without you telling me," retorted Mr. Golyakin Sr. in a rapid whisper. "No, Yakov Petrovich, I didn't mean that. That's not what I meant at all, Yakov Petrovich. I sympathize and I'm moved by genuine concern, from which I most humbly implore you to spare me now, if you don't mind. Of course, you'll put them in a folder, Yakov Petrovich, and insert a marker on the third page, if you don't mind, Yakov Petrovich. If you don't mind, please let me. But there's a blot here, Yakov Petrovich. Didn't you notice that blot?" Just then, Andrei Filipovich summoned Mr. Golyakin a second time. "I'm coming right away, Andrei Filipovich. I'm right here, just a little. Do you understand plain Russian, my dear sir? It's best to get it off with the penknife, Yakov Petrovich. You'd better leave it to me. Don't touch it yourself, Yakov Petrovich. Rely on me. I can get most of it off with the penknife." Andrei Filipovich summoned Mr. Golyakin for the third time. "Yes, for heaven's sake, but where is there a blot? There doesn't appear to be any blot at all. And it's a really huge one. There it is. There. That's where I saw it. Just allow me, Yakov Petrovich. I'll do it out of concern for you, Yakov Petrovich, with a penknife from a pure heart. There, it's done." And then, quite unexpectedly, without rhyme or reason, Mr. Golyakin Jr., having got the better of Mr. Golyakin Sr. in the momentary conflict that had arisen between them, and at any rate quite contrary to the latter's wishes, Mr. Golyakin Jr. seized possession of the document requested by his superiors, and instead of scraping it with the penknife from a pure heart as he had treacherously assured Mr. Golyakin Sr., quickly rolled it up, suffered it under his arm, and in two bounds was at the side of Andrei Filipovich, who hadn't noticed a single one of his pranks, and shot off with him into the director's office. Mr. Golyakin Sr. remained as if rooted to the spot, holding the penknife and apparently preparing to scrape something off of it. Our hero had not yet fully grasped his new situation. He had not come to his senses. He had left the blow, but thought it was of no importance. In terrible, indescribable anguish, he tore himself from where he was standing and charged straight into the director's office, beseeching heaven on the way that everything might somehow turn out for the best and would be all right. In the last room before the directors, he bumped straight into Andrei Filipovich and his namesake. They were both already coming back. Mr. Golyakin moved to one side. Andrei Filipovich was talking cheerfully and smiling. Mr. Golyakin Sr. namesake was also smiling, fussing about, tripping along at a respectful distance from Andrei Filipovich, whispering something in his ear with a rapturous look, to which Andrei Filipovich nodded in the most favorable fashion. Our hero grasped the whole situation in a flash. The fact was, his work, as he learnt later, had almost exceeded His Excellency's expectations and had been handed in by the deadline in good time. His Excellency was extremely satisfied. It was even rumored that His Excellency had said thank you to Mr. Golyakin Jr., a very warm thank you, had said that he would remember it when the occasion arose and that he would not fail to forget. Of course, Mr. Golyakin's first reaction was to protest with all his might, as much as was humanly possible. Almost beside himself and as pale as death, he rushed to Andrei Filipovich. When Andrei Filipovich heard that Mr. Golyakin's business was private, he refused to listen, flatly pointing out in no uncertain terms that he didn't have a moment to spare even for his own needs. The brusqueness of his refusal and chilly tones stunned Mr. Golyakin. Perhaps I'd better try a different approach. I'd better go to Anton Antonovich, he thought. But unfortunately for Mr. Golyakin, Anton Antonovich was not available either. He too was busy somewhere. So it wasn't without something in mind that he asked to be spared explanations and gossip, our hero thought. So that's what the cunning old fox was driving at. In that case, I'll simply be bold and appeal to His Excellency. Still pale and feeling that his head was in complete turmoil, thoroughly perplexed as to what exactly he should decide upon, Mr. Golyakin sat down on a chair. It would be much better if all this were simply a trifling matter, he constantly thought. In fact, such a fishy business was even highly improbable. Firstly, it was all nonsense, and secondly, it couldn't possibly happen. Most likely it was a trick of the imagination, or something different had happened from what really was the case, or perhaps I must have been walking along and somehow completely mistook myself for someone else. In short, the whole thing's absolutely impossible. No sooner had Mr. Goliakin decided that the whole thing was absolutely impossible than Mr. Goliakin Jr. suddenly came flying into the room with papers in both hands and under his arm. Having addressed some necessary words to Andrei Filipovich, exchanging a few more with someone else, politely greeting another, treating another with easy familiarity, Mr. Goliakin Jr., having on the face of it no time at all to waste, already seemed about to leave the room. Unfortunately, Mr. Goliakin Sr., he stopped right at the door to talk to 2 or 3 young clerks who happened to be standing there. Mr. Goliakin Sr. rushed straight towards him. The moment Mr. Goliakin Jr. spotted Mr. Goliakin Sr.'s maneuver, he immediately started looking around in panic to see where he could slip away the fastest. But our hero had already grabbed his previous evening's guest by the sleeve. The clerks surrounding the 2 titular counselors fell back and awaited events with considerable curiosity. The old titular counselor, Mr. Goliakin Sr., understood that favorable opinion was not on his side, and he understood very well that they were all intriguing against him, which made it all the more imperative for him to make a stand. It was a moment of truth. "Well, sir," asked Mr. Goliakin Jr., looking rather brazenly at Mr. Goliakin Sr. Mr. Goliakin Sr. was barely breathing. "I don't know, my dear sir," he began, "how to make you understand how strangely you're behaving towards me." "Well, sir, do go on." Here Mr. Goliakin Jr. looked around and winked at the surrounding clerks as if giving them to understand that the comedy was just about to begin. The insolence and shamelessness of your conduct, my dear sir, in the present circumstances, denounce you more than any words of mine could do. Don't bank on the success of the game you're playing. It's a rotten one. Yeah, the junior's acting weird. Okay. "Well, please do tell me how you slept, Yakov Petrovich," asked Mr. Goliakin Jr., looking Mr. Goliakin Sr. straight in the eye. "You, my dear sir, are forgetting yourself," said our titular counselor, utterly baffled and barely feeling the floor beneath him. "I hope you will change your tone." "My little sweet pie," Mr. Goliakin Jr. said, pulling a somewhat unseemly face at Mr. Goliakin Sr., and suddenly, right out of the blue, under the guise of a caress, he pinched his rather chubby right cheek between 2 of his fingers. Our hero reddened like fire. The moment Mr. Goliakin Sr.'s friends noticed that his adversary, shaking in every limb red as a lobster and exasperated beyond all measure, might even decide on a real attack, he in turn immediately forestalled him in a most shameless manner. After pinching his cheek twice more, tickling him a couple of times, and toying with him in this way for a few more seconds as he stood there motionless and mad with rage, to the not inconsiderable amusement of the young clerks standing around, Mr. Goliakin Jr. rounded things off with the most startling effrontery by giving Mr. Goliakin Sr. rather rotund belly a prod and saying with the most venomous leer that hinted as much, "You're a tricky customer, Yakov Petrovich, old chap. You're a tricky customer. We'll be cunning, you and I. We'll be cunning." And then before our hero had time to make even the slightest recovery from this latest assault, Mr. Goliakin Jr., after directing only a preliminary grin at the surrounding spectators, suddenly assumed to the most businesslike, formal, and official air, looked down at the floor, huddled up, and shrank into himself. And after rapidly saying he was on a special mission, jerked his stumpy legs into action and darted into the next room. Our hero couldn't believe his eyes, and he was still in no condition to come to his senses. But at last he did come to his senses, realizing in a flash that he was finished, that he had perished, been destroyed in a sense, that he had disgraced himself, sullied his reputation, that he had been humiliated and made a laughingstock in the presence of disinterested parties, that he had been treacherously abused by the person whom only yesterday he had considered his greatest and most trustworthy friend, that he had finally fallen flat on his face, and how Mr. Goliakin charged off in pursuit of his enemy. At that moment, he no longer wanted to think of those who had witnessed the outrage perpetuated on him. "They're all hand in glove," he told himself. "They all stand up for one another, and each sets the other against me." However, after about a dozen steps, our hero clearly saw that any pursuit was vain and futile, and so he turned back. "You won't get away with it," he thought. "I'll trump you all in good time. You'll get your just deserts." With fierce sang-froid and the most energetic determination, Mr. Goliakin returned to his chair and sat down. "You won't get away with it," he repeated. No longer was it a question of some kind of passive self-defense. There was nothing decisive and aggressive in the air, and anyone who saw Mr. Goliakin just then flushed, barely able to contain his agitation, stabbing his pen into the inkwell, and the fury with which he set about scribbling on the paper, might have concluded in advance that the matter would not rest there, nor could it fizzle out in some old womanish way. In the depths of his soul, he had made one resolution, and deep in his heart, he vowed to carry it out. If truth be told, he didn't quite know what steps to take. Rather, he had no idea at all, but it didn't matter. It was all right. He will achieve nothing by imposture and insolence. In this day and age, my dear sir, imposture and insolence lead to no good, only to the gallows. Only Grishka Atreyev, my dear sir, succeeded by imposture, deceiving the blind populace, but even then, not for long. In spite of this last circumstance, Mr. Goliakin decided to wait until masks fell from certain faces and something would come to light. To achieve this, It was first necessary for office hours to finish as soon as possible. Until that time, our hero proposed to undertake nothing. And then, when the working day was over, he would take a certain step. Then he would know how to act, and after taking that step, how to organize his whole campaign in order to shatter the horn of pride and crush the serpent that gnawed the dust in impotent scorn, to be used like a rag for people to wipe their dirty boots on, that he could not allow. To that he could not agree, particularly in the present circumstances, but for that last outrage, our hero might have taken courage. Perhaps he might have decided to remain silent and not protest too strongly. He might have argued a little, complained, demonstrated that he was in the right, and then yielded a little, and then perhaps a little more, and then he would have given his complete agreement, especially when the opposing party had solemnly admitted that he was within his rights, and then perhaps he would even have made peace, would even have rather touched, and who could tell? He would even been rather touched, and who could tell? Perhaps a new friendship would have sprung up, a firm, warm friendship on an even broader basis than yesterday's evenings, a friendship that might, in the end, have so eclipsed all the unpleasantness of that rather unseemly likeness between two people that both titular counselors who had been absolutely delighted and would have lived to a ripe old age, and so on. To sum up, Mr. Golyakin was even beginning slightly to regret that he had stood up for himself and his rights, and in consequence had only run into unpleasantness. If only he'd given in, wondered Mr. Golyakin, and said it was all a joke, I'd have forgiven him. I'd even have forgiven him all the more if he'd only admitted it out loud. But no, I won't let myself be used as a rag. I never let such people use me as a boot cloth, and even less will I allow this depraved wretch to attempt it. I'm not a rag, my dear sir. Oh no, I'm not a rag. In short, our hero had made up his mind. You yourself are to blame, my good sir, he thought. So he had decided to protest, and protest to the very last with all his strength. That's the kind of man he was. He could not possibly agree to let himself be insulted, even less to be used as a rag, and least of all by some completely depraved person. But let us not argue about it. Let us not argue. Perhaps if someone had so wanted, if someone had had an irresistible urge, for example, to turn Mr. Golyakin into a rag, then he might have done so without meeting and opposition and with impunity. Mr. Golyakin himself had been aware of this on occasions, and then the result would have been a rag and not a Golyatkin. Yes, a rag, a disgusting, filthy rag, but not an ordinary rag, though. This rag would have had its pride. This rag would have been endowed with animation and feelings, and even though those feelings would have been mute and hidden deep within the filthy folds of that rag, they would nonetheless have been feelings. The hours seemed to drag past. Finally, it struck 4. Shortly afterwards, everyone got up, followed the head of the department, and headed homewards. Mr. Golyakin mingled with the crowd. He was on the alert and did not let his quarry out of his sight. Finally, our hero saw his friend run up to the office porters who were handing out the coats, and in his usual blackguardly way was fidgeting around everyone while waiting for his. It was a moment for decision. Mr. Golyakin somehow managed to squeeze his way through the crowd, and he too started fussing about for his overcoat, not wishing to fall behind. But Mr. Golyakin's friend and acquaintance was first to get his coat, for even here he had managed in his own fashion to wheedle, to suck up to everyone, to curry favor, whisper in people's ears, and behave like a cad. After throwing on his overcoat, Mr. Golyakin Jr. gave Mr. Golyakin Sr. an ironic look, thus spiting him openly and brazenly, and then, with his characteristic insolence, minded around the other clerks, most probably to leave a favorable impression, making a witty remark to one, whispering something to another, toadying politely to a third, directing a smile at a fourth, giving his hand to a fifth, and then flitting gaily down the stairs. Mr. Golyakin went after him, and to his indescribable satisfaction overtook him on the last step and grabbed his coat collar. Mr. Golyakin Jr. seemed somewhat dumbfounded and looked around with a lost air. What do you mean by this? He finally whispered weakly to Mr. Golyakin. My dear sir, if you are in any way a decent gentleman, I trust you will recall our friendly relations of yesterday, said our hero. Ah, yes, well, what now? Did you sleep well? For a moment, fury deprived Mr. Golyakin Sr. of the power of speech. Yes, I did, but please allow me to tell you, my dear sir, that you're playing a highly complicated game. Who says so? It's my enemies who say that. The self-styled Mr. Golyakin brusquely. Yes, I did, but please allow me to tell you. Okay, who says so? It's my enemies who say that. The self-styled Mr. Golyakin brusquely replied and suddenly freed himself from the real Mr. Golyakin's feeble grasp. Once free, he dashed down the stairs, looked around, and, seeing a cab driver, climbed into the droshky, and in a flash disappeared from Mr. Golyakin Sr.'s view. Despairing and deserted by all, the titular counselor looked around, but there were no other cabs. He tried to run, but his legs gave way beneath him. With an utterly downcast face, his mouth gaping, crushed, shrunken, and helpless, he leaned against a lamppost, and there he stayed for several minutes. In the middle of the pavement, all was lost from Mr. Golyakin, it seemed. That's the end of chapter 8.